Toddler and preteen years. Although I was born in Mountain View, California, and spent most of my life and all of my childhood in the United States, there was a short window when my mother went to Mexico for reasons she never told me. That's right, she took her 3 children after she had been separated from her husband, my father, Silver Seaborn. And to this day, no one ever knew why she went to Mexico alone with those 3 incredibly young children. I have speculated she went to Mexico as a last-ditch effort to meet up with Silver or support one of his illegal dealings across the border. I was so little that I do not remember much of anything from my toddler tour in Mexico, but I do remember a few things. I remember a toy marionette with strings to manipulate its articulating legs, arms, and head. It was cheap, but I had never seen such a miraculous thing and was in awe of it. But my sisters dominated play with it, so I watched, virtually never had a turn with the string-controlled doll. It seemed wrong to me that my mother never seemed to care to make my sisters share the marionette with me. I was the littlest kid, so oh well. My sisters insisted that I would ruin it by tangling up its strings. How could they know that? And I am sure it would not have been the case. I was probably more careful about things than they ever were. But my mother was conflict-averse and was on a mission in Mexico, so did not want to be distracted by kid infighting. For my entire life, it has been repeatedly proven that my mother will stand by me for things I do, but she will not defend me or compromise her goals for mine. It's simple priorities. Her goals were greater than my goals. Done. As an aside, my mother has sacrificed and compromised for my eldest sister, Cynthia, which is inconsistent with what she has done for any other child, any other of her children. It's just, I never understood. There are differences in her priorities when it comes to Cynthia. Another thing I remember from Mexico was lots of smelly and smoky food. I did not like it much at all, but it was everywhere. At least everywhere that we were. I also remember, probably pretty strongly, a few other recollections. My mother left my sisters and me with a Mexican woman and her own children. The Mexican family lived in an old multi-residence building, sort of like a run-down duplex, but with rows of attached houses, or maybe homes, kind of like a military base or low-budget motel row on a ground floor. It was cheap when it was new, and it was decrepit now that it was old. Of course, we were living in a car before that, so I suppose being in a judgmental place like that is not so judgmentally bad at all. After all, they actually had walls and a ceiling. We just had car doors. But I was a kid, and I did perceive things that we were staying was kind of scary. It was a dump. But we were there for several days. I worried where my mother was, and if she would ever come back to get me. Every night I went to sleep wondering that. Every time I woke up, I wondered where she was. Honestly, I worried about myself first and foremost, and then I worried about my sisters. Somehow, being alone was a big deal to me. I felt alone. While we waited anxiously for my mother's return to that Mexican woman where we were, she would be our caretaker. It would be a huge stretch to say that she was a surrogate mother, because she treated us more like animals that were put in a shelter that had to be fed and sheltered, and nothing more. There was a daddy long-legged spider in a water cup she gave me, and I called it out, but she ordered to ignore it and drink my water. My Mexican mom demanded that water should not be wasted, and if there's a spider, It didn't matter. And then she looked in my cup and said, "I don't see a spider. There is not a spider." Well, obviously there was a spider in the bottom of the cup. I wouldn't make something horrific like that up. I would not remember something that all these ages later. No, but I was a tiny kid, a little teeny tiny child. And I was in a foreign country with strange people, with no idea when or even if my mother was going to ever come back for me. I was trapped and had nowhere to go and know how to complain. So what did I do? I drank the water as I watched terrified at the bottom of that cup in fear that spider might release itself and come into my mouth and I'd have to swallow it. In hindsight, I think it's insane that I actually drank from that cup and I took that woman's direction. A total stranger telling me effectively, "Drink that spider." The Mexican caretaker's only credibility was that my mother told my sisters and me to listen to her like she was our mother. Well, that's what I did. I listened to the woman as if she was my mother, and I suffered for it. This would prove to me a recurring theme in my life. Listen to my mother and get hurt. Well, there's another thing from Mexico I remember. That woman, my caretaker, one evening she generously said, "We're having a great meal today." She served cow tongue tamales for dinner. It was supposed to be a treat. Or so she kept saying anyway. Her children seemed to think it was a treat. It looked and tasted weird. It was laden with spices to mask the nasty taste and texture. The consistency of the meat was gross. After one bite, I was done. I was berated by the Mexican mom, and she told me that I would not have anything else to eat because that was what they had for dinner. She didn't lie. I went hungry. But I could not stomach eating that horrendous cow tongue tamale. I just couldn't. And yet one more thing I do also remember, my last memory from Mexico as a toddler, was the Mexican mom, our caretaker's children, her kids. They took me outside to play. They were much older than I was. Boys and girls, they were probably between 8, maybe even some in their early teens. She had a lot of children. I do not recall how many, but there were at least 5, maybe more. They took me around the big motel-like apartment complex to a partially collapsed warehouse building. There were cinder blocks, rebar, broken beer and wine, and hard liquor bottles strewn everywhere. The place was an abandoned death trap, and her kids played in it. And they brought me to play there too. It turned out, though, her kids had no intention of playing with me. They had taken me to a place far enough away that I had no idea how to get back to where I was staying. Even if I could remember and recognize the place that we were staying, I had only just been dropped off at, a few days ago? Dare I say I was abandoned a few days ago? Well, her kids taunted me. They called me the white boy, gringo, dumb American. Any words they could say that was either in English or that apparently meant in Spanish that I was simply scum. They said all sorts of terrible and nasty things. I don't remember. I don't think I understood more than half. But they miraged me with a litany of insult and cruelty, and their voices did not betray the hatred they had towards me. I don't know why they hated me. I was a little kid. Later in life, of course, they hated me because I was white. That simply was it. They were racist against me. As if I was racist. And yet I was a defenseless, tiny, innocent toddler, and they didn't care. For no reason at all, I was discriminated against as the white toddler in Mexico. They ran off. They abandoned me in the dangerous warehouse, a toddler, alone in a big warehouse with rebar, cement, Death traps everywhere in Mexico. Again, alone, abandoned. I ran after them and was able to keep up for a while, just enough to see them enter the apartment building that we were staying at. I just kept up enough to see. I ran and I ran and I ran, and I got inside and I hid in a corner where they loaned me a blanket to stay and sleep. Yes, that was a lesson to me as a toddler. People, whether they're children or adults, are mean. They are cruel. And maybe people cannot be trusted. My mother can leave me alone for a very long time, maybe forever. She did eventually come back, but I think that was a series of harsh experiences for a toddler that is really tough to cope with. Dr. Brandon's iPad window glowed and pulsed as he began to speak. What an incredible story you have there, Richard. As a toddler, you went on an amazing road trip to Mexico, and you experienced culture, toys, music, and even a little social diversity. It sounds like an exciting time for a child. Perhaps your time in Mexico felt more like a misadventure than an adventure given your list of unpleasant experiences. Brandon continued. I recognize, Richard, you felt abandoned and left alone. That surely tainted your perspective. But you detailed caretakers with someone around most of the time, which for that era, when you were a child, was actually quite appropriate supervision. Do you think you may have catastrophized some early memories to make yourself into a sort of martyr in your own eyes? Maybe a kind of method to your coping mechanism? Deep feelings of abandonment so early in life, Richard, can have lifelong implications to your psyche, and it can affect how your brain forms neural pathways and emotional cognitive associations. Memories like these, Richard, can help us deconstruct and understand your memories from later in life. Everything inside us is built from DNA, environment, and experiences. You know, nature and nurture, but now it's nature, nurture, and DNA. Is there something you would like to add to that, Richard? No, I replied. I have nothing more to add. I paused for a while, hoping they would just continue. There was nothing. Awkward. I continued. Okay, actually, there is something. I kind of blurted out excitedly when I felt like I had to say something. I'm not sure why I was so energized. I did not feel abandoned. I was abandoned. I was not just abandoned once as a child. I was left with strangers in Mexico, like I said. I have been forgotten at both a public park and an amusement park. I've been left to wander and find my way home. I have been left in lines at community events, like we went to see Santa Claus once, but when I finally got to Santa, there were no parents there. There were no siblings. There was nobody I knew around, just this big strange Santa, and I did not like that. That was very scary. I have sat outside my mother taking a college class, but no, she left. She forgot I was outside waiting for her to come out to get me. So random people find me. They eventually locate her through the school system's administration. I don't know how it all works. I'm a tiny little kid. Does that sound like enough yet? Well, there's more. Even when I went to preschool the very first time, the very first day, I remember it was scary. I'm sure it's scary to all little kids, but what did my mother do? No, she just dropped me off like a bag of potatoes. I'm bawling, crying, sobbing. Even teachers there, or whatever you call the caretakers, they were like, you need to take care of this kid. Nope, she just walked away. That's abandonment. I have been left home alone more times than I can remember, and I'm sure there's more abandonment that we'll yet uncover. My point is that my daily parenting, well, it's from my imagination. And later in life, it was from a black and white television show called Andy Griffith, where Sheriff Andy Taylor was effectively my father. Okay? I was kind of losing it there, as you could tell. I found myself almost yelling at points. I finally did blurt out, to suggest even a little bit that I was not abandoned as a kid. It's just wrong, wrong, wrong. I flailed my fist in the air and pounded my leg. I just didn't know what to do. I exclaimed, "Wrong!" And of course, it was getting overwhelming. I screamed, I feel so furious, my words were broken, about the idea that maybe I was exaggerating my situation as a kid left in another country with strangers that did not care about me. They could barely speak English. I certainly could not speak Spanish. And they had older, racist, abusive kids that hated the little gringo named Rishi. Why on earth would you conclude that from that tale of woe and being a child victim? I demanded. Dr. Hyder's iPad window glowed as he leaned forward toward his camera as if to reach out and touch me. It's okay, Richard. Dr. Brandon's question was about how you felt, not questioning what happened then or to you. He paused, slowly removing his hand from my shoulder as if it was there, returning to his chair in the window. I am so sorry you were abandoned as a child. Hyder paused, rather dramatically, in a very serious, almost consoling expression over the window. It's the most support I honestly have seen from anyone so far. It must have been extremely difficult to cope with being left behind in so many instances. He paused again, very dramatically. I'm sure it hurt a lot. Another dramatic pause. In fact, he paused so much, so many dramatic points, that I started wondering if everything is dramatic. Is anything dramatic? Maybe he just talks slowly. Maybe this is because he's Indian and English is his second language. I really didn't know. I mean, it was pretty clear English was his second language. He was, as they say, ESL. I mean, he had a thick native Indian accent. He was kind of hard to understand. But he was by far the most compassionate, and he seemed genuinely interested right then of helping me. That's quite the contrast to Dr. Caselli, who's frankly a total prick. Hyder continued. I am sure it is even still hurting you as you think about your mother's role when she forgot about you and left you behind. About those feelings of abandonment. It is okay to share or express any of those feelings that you may have around your mother or abandonment. It's also okay to shelve them. We can visit them as a topic in future, if you like. Dr. Hyder spoke again. I am sorry, Richard. Dr. Brandon is right. We should put these topics on a future to-do list with the others. Would you please continue? Maybe a different topic? I nodded and I resumed my tale.